Welcome, everyone. On this channel, we dive deep into the chilling stories of serial killers and the most notorious criminal cases in history. Today, we're exploring the rare phenomenon of female serial killers. Do they truly exist? Why is their number so significantly lower than that of men, and what exactly drives them? We will conduct an in-depth analysis of the Maria Petrova case, the woman often cited as the only female serial killer in the history of modern Russian forensics. Why was she labeled a male-type killer? Why did she hunt men? And why was she never sent to prison? To answer these questions, we're joined by Senior Detective Dmitry Mironov, who led the investigation into Petrova's crime. The story begins in early March 2002. At a bus stop on Varshavskoye Highway, a 20-year-old man was brutally murdered. When the paramedics arrived, they found him with his carotid artery severed.
The nature of the crime was highly unusual. There were no signs of robbery or assault. It was a single, lethal strike, aimed solely at the throat, resulting in maximum blood loss. After that, the perpetrator simply vanished. There was no tampering with the body, no dragging of the victim, and the pockets remained untouched. No robbery, no post-mortem manipulations, just one clean, clinical kill.
Witnesses, who didn't immediately realize they were watching a murder unfold, later told the police a chilling detail. The perpetrator disappeared into an underground passage, only to return a few moments later to catch a final glimpse of the man bleeding out on the pavement. It was as if they wanted to witness the life leaving their victim's body.
A facial composite was impossible to produce. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the fading twilight, combined with the distance of the witnesses, made it hard to see any features. However, they were able to provide a basic description: a figure in a dark tracksuit and a dark knit cap, a shadow in the night that left no face behind.
A month later, the killer struck again. This time on Savarskaya Street, just a short distance from the Varshavskaya Highway. The modus operandi was identical: a single, devastating knife wound to the neck, leaving the victim to bleed out on the cold pavement. Once again, money and documents were left untouched. But there was a new, disturbing twist. The victim wasn't a young man this time. He was a pensioner. The killer's profile was shifting, or perhaps their hunger for violence didn't care about the age of the target. Soon, the Zyu'zino crimes were linked and consolidated into a single case. A specialized task force from the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, MUR, was brought in to take charge. For weeks, investigators worked around the clock. They conducted hundreds of witness interviews and meticulously mapped out the killer's suspected routes. At the same time, they began a massive sweep of the area, profiling ex-convicts who had previously served time for similar violent offenses. They were looking for a seasoned predator, a man who had done this before.
The investigation focused entirely on finding a man, likely a young, fit athlete. There was even a theory that the killer might be motivated by repressed homosexual urges, given the specific man-on-man nature of the attacks. Simultaneously, detectives explored the possibility of hate crimes or racially motivated attacks. At that stage, almost no one could have imagined that these brutal acts were being committed by a young woman. It simply didn't fit the established criminal profile.
On April 20th, the killer struck again, this time on Odeskia Street. The victim was another man in his 60s, but for the first time, the strike wasn't fatal. Over the next few weeks, the spree continued, with at least 2 more attempted murders. 3 survivors were now able to provide crucial testimony. To the investigators' utter shock, all 3 victims claimed their attacker wasn't a man, it was a woman. However, the detectives remained skeptical. They struggled to take these accounts at face value, suspecting that the trauma and shock might have clouded the victim's memory.
The turning point came with the cumulative weight of eyewitness testimony. In cases like this, subjective perception is everything. Despite the suspect's athletic build, tall stature, and the baggy tracksuit, witnesses began to pinpoint something undeniably feminine, a certain softness in the facial features that felt distinctly girlish. When several independent witnesses, all grown men, insist they saw a woman, it forces a difficult question. How is this even possible? This level of aggression is entirely uncharacteristic of female offenders. The idea of a young woman stalking the streets with a knife, hunting grown men, felt like a defiance of criminal logic. Yet eventually, the investigators could no longer ignore the evidence. They had to pivot their entire strategy to account for a female suspect.
The theory that a woman was behind these brutal attacks only made the investigation more complex. Her motive remained a complete mystery. She operated in crowded areas, right in front of dozens of witnesses, with no attempt to steal money or documents. She had no prior connection to her victims. All of these factors pointed to what is known as a male-type criminal pattern. Stalking random strangers on the street with a knife is a hallmark of the classic serial killer, a role almost exclusively filled by men. This raises a fundamental question: can we even apply the term maniac or serial killer to a woman in this context? Our stereotypes tell us one thing, the statistics another, but this specific case forces us to rewrite the rulebook. From a psychological standpoint, female serial killers do exist, though they are far less common than their male counterparts. Their motives and patterns of violence are usually fundamentally different. This is why they are often placed in a separate category. They don't fit the classic image of a serial killer, an image the public typically associates with sexual sadism and performative violence. Female-led crimes are often less impulsive and more covert, sometimes spanning years. Their motives frequently revolve around financial gain, control, psychological dependency, or a warped sense of care and power.
If we take the total number of serial killers as 100%, the proportion of women among them is incredibly small. Various estimates place it at roughly 5 to 7%. But even when we zoom in on this rare group of female serial killers, a sexual motive remains an extreme outlier. Within this demographic, the sexual component is almost non-existent, a stark contrast to male serial killers for whom sexual gratification is often a primary driver of their criminal behavior.
One of the defining characteristics of classic male serial killers is the presence of a sexual motive. Of course, not every offender commits acts of sexual violence, nor does every killer achieve direct sexual gratification from the murder itself. However, psychiatrists observe that in the vast majority of these cases, perpetrators exhibit various forms of paraphilias or other sexual deviations. In other words, their arousal is triggered by objects, scenarios, or situations that are far outside the norm. For female serial killers, such manifestations are significantly rarer. As a rule, their crimes lack a pronounced sexual drive, and achieving sexual satisfaction through the act of violence is highly uncharacteristic.
Psychology offers no single explanation for this disparity, only hypotheses. One theory suggests that when the male psyche shatters, the break is more profound. Sexuality often plays a much more dominant role in the formation of male identity than it does for women. Women, historically and psychologically, are more likely to find fulfillment through other social roles. not through the alpha male drive for dominance, but through roles of caregiving, motherhood, or domestic life. Consequently, when women do commit serial crimes, their actions are often twisted reflections of these very roles. These patterns are consistently supported by forensic studies and historical cases of female serial offenders. We will return to the investigation of the Zyu'zino attacks shortly, but first, let's look at specific examples from Soviet and post-Soviet forensics to understand the true motives behind female-led serial crimes.
The absolute leading motive among female serial killers is financial gain. These are women who kill for insurance payouts, assets, or simply to eliminate anyone standing in the way of their personal goals. This creates a specific criminal pattern that differs drastically from that of men. Their methods of choice are typically poisoning or suffocation. Violent, performative displays of aggression are extremely rare. These crimes follow an instrumental logic. The goal is to eliminate the victim as quietly as possible, leaving no trace, allowing the killer to move forward with her life undetected. In formal criminological classification, this is known as a hedonistic motive, specifically one aimed at achieving personal comfort. In popular culture and forensics, this group is notoriously known as Black Widows.
Tamara Ivanutna stands as one of the most chilling examples of a hedonistic female serial killer in Soviet history. For Tamara, murder was a family tradition. Her parents, Anton and Maria Maslenko, raised her with a ruthless philosophy. Any grudge could be settled with Clarice solution, a highly toxic thallium mixture. They poisoned neighbors over petty arguments, once even offering a lethal shot of vodka as a toast to a victim. Tamara refined this family business into a tool for social climbing. After her first marriage, she began microdosing her husband's food with thallium. Her plan worked perfectly. He died of a supposed heart attack, leaving her his 2-bedroom apartment. Later, in Kiev, she remarried and within days poisoned both her father-in-law and mother-in-law to seize their country estate for a pig farm.
Her greed eventually led to a terrifying spree at a local school. Working as a dishwasher to secure free feed for her livestock, Tamara became a shadow of death in the cafeteria. She showed no mercy, poisoning children who asked for leftover scraps to feed their dogs, and murdering staff members who reprimanded her for poor performance. The horror peaked in 1987, when a mysterious illness swept through the school, leaving several children and adults dead. The facade crumbled when forensic tests revealed traces of thallium in the victims. Investigators noticed Tamara's aggressive behavior during the inspection, leading to a search of her home. There, hidden inside a sewing machine kit, they found the lethal vial. The trial exposed a literal family of monsters. Tamara, her sister, and her parents were linked to 40 poisonings and 13 deaths. While her relatives received long prison terms, the court showed Tamara no mercy. She became the last woman in the Soviet Union to be sentenced to death by firing squad. Her case remains a haunting anomaly, proving that sometimes the most domestic settings can hide the most calculated evil.
The second most common category of female serial killers is the so-called angels of death, or angels of mercy, as they are sometimes known. This group predominantly includes healthcare workers, such as nurses, as well as women suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In these cases, the offender deliberately induces illness in those under their care. Historically, there was a specific subcategory of these killers,
the proprietors of baby farms for illegitimate children, a dark staple of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. In those days, the social stigma of raising a child out of wedlock forced many women to leave their infants at these facilities for a small fee. The children were often subjected to horrific abuse or total neglect, eventually dying from lack of care. In some cases, however, it was simply murder for the sake of murder. For angels of death, the motive is distinct. It is often a pathological need for absolute control over another person's life, or, as the killers themselves often justify it, a desire to save the victim by relieving them of their suffering. Svetlana Akhly appeared to be the epitome of maternal virtue. Based in Krasnodon, near Luhansk, she was a celebrated figure, officially awarded the prestigious title of Mother Heroine. The Akhly family was a local sensation. Their children were high achievers who performed songs in a family ensemble. But behind this impeccable facade lay a dark reality that would later earn Svetlana a different title, the Angel of Death. The horror began to surface after 2010, when Svetlana and her husband adopted 3 siblings, Ilya, Liza, and Katya. While Ilya became a permanent fixture in the family's public performances, the 2 young sisters gradually vanished from sight. The truth emerged only in August 2012, when a 2-year-old girl named Nastya was kidnapped from a nearby village. Witnesses described a woman in a black headscarf snatching the child and speeding off in a motorcycle sidecar. When police tracked the child to the Akhly's summer cottage, the family calmly insisted the toddler was their adopted daughter, Liza. The lie collapsed instantly when Nastya's biological parents arrived and identified their daughter. Facing the inevitable, Svetlana's husband and eldest daughter broke their silence, revealing a house of horrors. They confessed that the kidnapping was a desperate attempt to replace the children Svetlana had already murdered. The investigation revealed that 4-year-old Liza had died in 2011 after days of relentless beatings. To hide the crime, Svetlana forced her family to help burn the child's body in a metal vat. 9 months later, 2-year-old Katya met a similar fate and was buried in a shallow grave. During the trial, the public learned of the calculated torture the foster children endured, being forced to stand in corners for days and facing brutal violence for the slightest disobedience. In December 2012, Svetlana Akhly was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Even as she was led away, the mother heroine remained defiant, refusing to admit guilt. Her case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a predator can hide behind a mask of social perfection. In psychology, there is another prevalent motive among female serial offenders: revenge. This is a trait rarely seen in men in this specific context. While male killers often direct their rage at society as a whole, women driven by revenge tend to be surgical. They target specific individuals who have wronged or obstructed them, executing their vengeance with methodical precision. So, where does the Varshavskaya highway killer fit? She clearly wasn't a black widow or a common thief. It's highly unlikely she was seeking revenge against her victims. She didn't even know them. Was she a self-styled angel of death? Or was she one of those exceedingly rare women who derive pure, twisted pleasure from the act of killing itself? By April 2002, investigators had no answers to these haunting questions, but one thing was undeniable. They were dealing with an organized offender.
The first red flag was the nature of the attacks, seemingly illogical, atypical, and senseless, yet executed during moments of minimal witness presence. This wasn't a case of someone in the throes of a psychotic break rushing into the street to slash at random. Instead, we see a much more calculated and goal-oriented behavior. The perpetrator evaluates the victim, runs past them, and gradually enters a state of heightened arousal. It's reminiscent of a shark circling its prey before moving in for the kill. There may even be a hidden sexual component, subtle yet undeniably present. In other words, we are dealing with a predator who derives visceral pleasure from the act of the hunt itself.
Supporting the hypothesis that the killer had developed a taste for blood and was unlikely to stop was a chilling trend: the shrinking intervals between attacks. The timeline spoke for itself. A full month had passed between the first and second murders. Between the second and third, the gap closed to 3 weeks. By the fourth attack, the window had narrowed to just 2 weeks. This rapid acceleration in the criminal cycle is a classic indicator that the perpetrator is spiraling, driven by a growing compulsion that demands more frequent satisfaction.
It was the beginning of a relentless hunt for a predator, essentially a hunt for a dangerous animal. The streets were saturated with undercover units. Officers in civilian clothes patrolled the area in various guises, ready to act at the first sign of a provocation. The task force even prepared for the possibility that the killer might target one of their own. They were ready to use officers as live bait to lure the suspect out. But the killer didn't take the bait. The predator was cautious, sensing the shifting atmosphere of the streets.
In the end, the capture of the predator was a stroke of pure luck. A facial composite had been circulated to every police precinct across southern Moscow. It wasn't long before a trainee detective patrolling the streets spotted a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the sketch. It was a mundane moment that ended a reign of terror. Amidst the massive sting operations and undercover stakeouts, it was the sharp eye of a rookie that finally brought the investigation to its climax.
He lit a cigarette, but it slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground. As he bent down to pick it up, his eyes locked onto something that made his heart skip a beat. There, on the pavement, right in front of him, was a sneaker, and on it, a single, unmistakable drop of blood.
The trainee immediately alerted the local precinct officer. Acting quickly but cautiously, they began to shadow the suspect, following her all the way to her apartment building on Kashirsky Pryezd. They maintained a discreet distance until she reached the entrance. As the door swung open, they moved in, following the suspected killer into the dimly lit hallway. The hunt was finally coming to an end.
She stepped into the elevator first, and we followed right behind her. In that confined space, she suddenly lost her composure. We were young back then, fearless, honestly. The thought that she might pull a knife and slash us right there didn't even cross our minds. She clutched her bag, panicked, and darted out of the elevator, shouting, "I'll take the stairs." It was the erratic behavior of someone who knew the game was up.
After pinpointing exactly which apartment the woman lived in, the trainee and his colleague didn't rush the arrest. Instead, they discreetly withdrew and headed back to the police precinct to report to their superiors. They had secured the target's location without alerting her further. Now it was time for the tactical phase of the operation to begin.
Her eyes, they were haunting. It's the same look you see when you're cornered by a rabid dog or a wolf, wide, dilated, and literally pooling with blood. In that second, I was paralyzed with fear. I was certain that this was it, that she was about to snap and tear us apart right then and there.
That same day, detectives arrived at the apartment on Kashirsky Proyezd to make the arrest. The suspect was identified as 24-year-old Maria Petrova. To everyone's disbelief, she was a physical education teacher at the Moscow Electronic Technology Technical School. Her parents were in the apartment during the raid. Later, Maria's father would make a staggering admission to investigators. He had suspected his daughter's involvement in the Zyu'zino murders for weeks. He had watched her, noticed the patterns, but remained silent as the body count rose.
The truth finally emerged in the most mundane of places, the family bathroom. Her father walked in and caught her red-handed as she was meticulously washing blood off a knife after another attack. When she looked up and met his gaze, he didn't need a confession. He later told investigators that in that single look, he read everything. In an instant, he realized exactly who his daughter had become.
At first, Maria Petrova remained defiant, denying any involvement and refusing to cooperate with investigators. The wall of silence seemed impenetrable until one detective decided to change tactics. He offered her a deal, a psychological gambit. If she confessed to just a single attack, she would be allowed to walk free. It was a blatant fabrication, a classic interrogation room ruse, but it worked. Believing she had found a loophole, Maria finally began to speak. What started as a single admission soon turned into a flood of chilling revelations.
What followed was a legal mess that threatened to collapse the entire case. Because Petrova's initial confession had been obtained through deception, it was on incredibly shaky ground. As soon as her lawyer arrived, he shut everything down. He formally recanted her statement, claiming his client had been coerced and subjected to psychological pressure. Suddenly, the prosecution was left with almost nothing, except for that tiny speck of blood on her sneaker. But even that was circumstantial. A skilled defense could easily argue, my client is an athlete who runs these trails every day. She simply stepped in a puddle of blood left by the real killer. The investigators' prize witness was slipping through their fingers.
According to Dmitry Mironov, the breakthrough didn't come from interrogation tactics or legal threats. Maria only began to provide a full confession after he managed to establish psychological rapport with her. Mironov understood that Maria didn't see herself as a common criminal. To get her to speak, he had to stop treating her like a monster and start listening to her as a person. Once that bridge of trust was built, the floodgates opened. She stopped fighting the evidence and began to recount her hunts in chilling detail, no longer needing the false promises of freedom to tell her story.
No one was promising her freedom anymore, and no one could say how many years she would spend behind bars. But there is such a thing as human decency, a way of treating someone that, no matter how heinous their crimes, creates a space for them to open up and speak their truth. Even if a person chooses to embellish their story or omit certain details, the fundamental desire to be heard remains. Every killer at some level wants to unburden themselves. For Maria, this human connection was the key that finally unlocked her silence, allowing her to narrate the dark reality of her life without the need for deals or deception.
The making of Maria Petrova and the dark forces that drove her to kill remains a subject of intense debate. Public records often paint a picture of a perfectly ordinary family and a normal upbringing. However, darker accounts suggest a far more fractured childhood. According to some sources, when Masha was only 4 years old, her father, in a drunken rage, beat her mother so severely that she was hospitalized for days.
If true, this act of domestic violence was likely the first crack in Maria's psyche, planting a seed of resentment that would eventually grow into a deadly obsession with power and retaliation.
By all appearances, it was a textbook Soviet family, stable, supportive, and complete, consisting of a mother, a father, and an older brother. Both parents were masters of sport in swimming, respected educators, and decorated professionals in their field. There were no vices, no signs of dysfunction, and no social deviance whatsoever. There was no history of sexual abuse or harassment by her father or any other relatives, not in any form. Maria was born a healthy baby and grew up as a perfectly normal girl, embracing typical childhood interests, dolls, flowers, and the like. She did well in school, maintained a solid academic record, and graduated without issue. To those around her, she was unremarkable, neither a star nor a troublemaker. She was simply a face in the crowd, hidden in plain sight.
Other accounts paint a much more troubling picture of Maria's youth. According to these sources, she was withdrawn and socially isolated, occasionally exhibiting bursts of aggression toward animals and even her peers. The most significant turning point occurred during her adolescence. At that time, Maria was diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder and was formally registered at a psychiatric clinic. This diagnosis suggests that beneath her ordinary exterior, Maria was struggling with a fragmented perception of reality and a profound inability to form normal social bonds, traits that frequently serve as the psychological blueprint for future violent behavior.
In the heat of an argument, Maria suddenly lashed out, attacking her mother with her fists. It was a brief, violent outburst. No knives were drawn, no permanent injuries were inflicted, and there were no signs of self-harm. In many households, this would have been seen as a tragic, albeit common, domestic dispute. But her mother was a woman of rigid principles and unwavering discipline. In her mind, there was no room for such disorderly behavior. Determined to address the issue with clinical precision, she made a fateful decision. She called a psychiatrist. It was a move intended to restore order, but instead it effectively marked Maria as broken in the eyes of the system, and perhaps in her own eyes as well.
It is widely accepted that disorders within the schizophrenia spectrum and those involving a fractured perception of reality carry a strong genetic predisposition. However, environmental stressors act as the trigger. Under certain conditions, such as head trauma, childhood abuse, neglect, or bullying, these dormant genes can be activated. It is crucial to emphasize that individuals with these disorders are rarely aggressive. In fact, they are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Violent outbursts are the extreme exception, not the rule. Despite her diagnosis, Maria remained a detective swimmer, competing in citywide meets, but then she abruptly walked away from the sport she loved. According to one haunting theory, this sudden withdrawal followed a devastating trauma. At just 18 years old, Maria had been brutally raped.
Maria recounts the assault with a chilling sense of detachment, describing it not as a life-altering trauma, but merely as a factual occurrence. According to her, the perpetrator was an acquaintance. She had met him while out with a female friend. The three of them were invited for drinks, and they spent the evening together. Then, she claims, her drink was spiked. She woke up later with the harrowing realization that she had been raped. Her reaction, as she describes it, was eerily stoic. She simply composed herself and walked home. Later, she even crossed paths with the man again, but she chose only to ignore him, refusing even a simple greeting. There was no police report, no visible breakdown, only a silent internal hardening.
Violence and trauma are tragically common, often striking as early as childhood. However, if an individual is mentally resilient and surrounded by a supportive environment that aids in processing the trauma, they can find a way to compensate and lead a normal, fulfilling life. The danger arises when these safeguards are absent. When a person already struggles with a mental disorder and faces a cluster of risk factors such as violence or poverty, without the stabilizing influence of positive parental role models, the situation can spiral. In such cases, a diagnosis can escalate into extreme, aberrant behavior, potentially leading to lethal violence. Following high school, Maria's life seemed aimless. She completed a course for executive assistance and cycled through various jobs as a shop clerk and a waitress, but she never stayed anywhere for long. Instead of building a career or finding a professional calling, she became increasingly fixated on her personal life.
Maria was a striking woman and never lacked for male attention. In her early 20s, she began to embrace her sexuality with confidence. She wore miniskirts, accentuated her figure, and used makeup to highlight her features, all the typical behaviors of a young woman coming into her own. She was a regular at clubs in central Moscow, attending parties with friends and socializing with men. To any outsider, she appeared to be living the vibrant life of an attractive, outgoing woman in the heart of the capital. There was nothing to suggest that beneath this confident exterior, a dark transformation was taking place.
Maria's parents, however, viewed her lifestyle with mounting disapproval. The tension within the household reached a breaking point when Maria revealed she was pregnant. But the hope of a new beginning was short-lived. A devastating miscarriage followed. Instead of finding solace in her family, Maria was met with renewed hostility. The arguments escalated into constant scandals, with her parents repeatedly threatening to have her committed to a psychiatric ward. Trapped between the trauma of her loss and the psychological pressure from her own mother and father, Maria was pushed to the edge. The home that should have been her sanctuary had become her primary source of torment.
She had a relationship, reportedly with a friend of her brother. He was older, but not significantly so. There was nothing inherently abnormal or scandalous about their involvement. Naturally, as in any family, this led to the inevitable confrontations with her parents, particularly her mother. As is often the case, her mother was the first to find out, leading to the usual domestic friction. However, Maria herself never pointed to these events as the catalyst for her crimes. She didn't cling to these family disputes as a justification for why she eventually picked up a knife.
A few years before her first murder, Maria secured a position as an instructor at a technical college, while also taking on evening shifts at a local fitness club. This double life as an educator and a fitness trainer explains the peak physical condition that would later allow her to vanish so easily from crime scenes. Her students, however, found her difficult to connect with. They viewed her as withdrawn, even eccentric. Behind her back, some of them would snicker and mock their teacher's odd behavior. Little did they know that the awkward, quiet woman standing before them in the gym was harboring an internal storm that was about to break.
In the wake of her arrest, rumors began to swirl among the students. Suddenly, stories emerged of her muttering to herself or acting completely unstable. But the investigation told a different story. While they were still hunting for the killer, detectives had thoroughly checked the college. If any faculty member had truly been acting deranged or fit the profile of someone unhinged, someone would have spoken up. No one did. The claims about her appearance were equally distorted by hindsight. People began saying she dressed inappropriately, but what did that actually mean? Many skirts and high boots were the height of fashion at the time. She wasn't wearing them in the classroom every day. She wore them to work, just like any other young woman following the trends of the early 2000s. It wasn't madness, it was simply the style of the era.
Even during the most intense interrogations, Maria could never pinpoint the exact moment she decided to become a killer. One evening, she went out for her usual run, but this time something was different. She tucked a knife into the sleeve of her jacket, just in case, she told herself. As she passed a bus stop, she noticed a young man,
According to her statement, he grabbed her and began making unwanted advances. In an instant, the years of suppressed rage and the cold steel in her sleeve collided. Maria drew the blade and slashed it across his throat. It was her first strike, executed with the terrifying efficiency of an athlete.
The investigator pressed her. "Why were you carrying a knife in the first place?" "I took it with me for self-defense," she replied coolly, "in case of stray dogs." "And this man, did he assault you?" "He was sitting there, drunk. He insulted me." "Was it an insult that threatened your physical or sexual safety?" I thought he might rape me." The detective didn't buy it. "But how could you possibly think that? He was just sitting there, and you were simply running past him."
Why did she carry a knife? Psychologists suggest it stemmed from a profound, pervasive sense of vulnerability. While central Moscow in that era certainly had its dangers, Maria's response was extreme. Most women at the time didn't walk the streets with blades tucked into their sleeves. However, within the logic of her own fractured mind, her actions were entirely consistent. To Maria, the world was a predatory place where men were inherently dangerous, threats waiting to strike. In her mind, waiting for an attack to happen meant it was already too late, so she carried the knife just in case, adopting a fatalistic, whatever happens, happens mentality. From this distorted perspective, the transition from self-defense to unprovoked slaughter became chillingly simple. After the first murder on Varshavskoye Highway, a disturbing detail emerged. Maria had descended into the pedestrian underpass, only to double back minutes later. She returned to the exact spot where her victim lay bleeding out, watching the life drain from the young man. To this day, she has never explained why she felt the need to see him again. It was far from the only question that went unanswered. Even when Maria did speak, her words felt like a hollow mask rather than a true motive. For the first killing, she clung to the narrative of self-defense against unwanted advances. For the second, she claimed it was obsessive attention from an older colleague that finally pushed her over the edge. In her mind, she was never the villain, just a woman forced to strike back. Given her diagnosis of schizotypal personality disorder, it is highly probable that Maria suffered from severe misinterpretation of social cues. A hallmark of this spectrum is the tendency to shift neutral or mildly ambiguous situations toward a purely negative, threatening perception. Where an average person might see a drunk man on a bench as a mere nuisance, Maria's mind transformed him into a lethal predator. This cognitive distortion creates an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. For her, the world wasn't just unfriendly, it was fundamentally unsafe. In this state of perpetual perceived danger, her violent outbursts weren't seen by her as crimes, but as preemptive strikes to ensure her own survival.
The story of self-defense was nothing more than a cocoon, a narrative she hastily constructed to shield herself after her arrest. Her true motives were far more sinister. It was about the thrill. It was about pleasure. Carrying a knife on every run wasn't a precaution. It was a manifestation of her darkest fantasies. She didn't just stumble into violence. She rehearsed it, fed on it, and drew satisfaction from it long before the first strike. Those runs weren't exercise. They were hunting expeditions. She was a predator marking her territory, savoring the sight of potential prey. She was priming herself, fueling her excitement, until the tension became unbearable. And once she finally crossed that line and tasted blood, the pleasure
became an addiction.
This particular element of her crimes was something Maria never admitted to, perhaps because she lacked the self-awareness to recognize it, or perhaps because she was too terrified to face the truth. The conclusion that Petrova achieved a form of sexual or emotional release through the planning and execution of her attacks wasn't hers, it was Dmitry's. After spending countless hours with her during interrogations and crime scene reenactments, he saw through her defenses. He realized that the knives, the runs, and the blood weren't just symptoms of a disorder. They were the tools of a deeply ingrained private obsession that provided her with the only form of gratification she truly understood.
In a twisted way, these acts were her path to womanhood. It's difficult to put into words, but on an intuitive level, you can sense what drove her. Through these violent strikes, she was, in essence, attaining her own sense of feminine fulfillment. There is something of the Amazonian nature here, the warrior-huntress archetype. Through the act of hunting and the exercise of violence over her victims, she found her becoming. She discovered her true essence as a woman. And to be clear, this had nothing to do with feminist motives or ideology. It was something far more primal, a raw and lethal expression of self that bypassed social norms entirely, rooting her identity in the power of the blade.
Just over a month and a half passed between Maria's first murder and her eventual capture. Throughout that time, she maintained a flawless veneer of normalcy, showing up to work every day and even calculating how to use her job as an alibi. During interrogation, she revealed a chilling level of premeditation. She had planned to attack a victim during one of her fitness classes, intending to tell her clients she simply needed to step out for a moment. This level of planning proves that her actions were anything but impulsive. If she was thinking about alibis, she wasn't just carrying a knife for protection, she was staging her crimes with the precision of a professional, choosing exactly when and where the blade would emerge from her sleeve.
It is vital to shatter the stereotype of the clueless madwoman. She wasn't someone who simply lost touch with reality and ran into the street with a knife. On the contrary, this detail completes the portrait of a woman who lived for her crimes. Maria was deeply immersed in the process. She didn't just kill, she fantasized, she planned, and she literally reveled in the mental preparation for each attack. For her, the anticipation was just as intoxicating as the act itself. The knife in her sleeve wasn't a sudden whim, it was the culmination of hours spent nursing a dark obsession, savoring the thought of the strike long before it ever happened.
It appears that Maria lacked even a shred of fear regarding her capture. Her audacity was staggering. She struck in broad daylight, often in front of dozens of witnesses, and felt no urgent need to flee the scene. Her chosen method was visceral and intimate. Killing with a knife requires close physical contact, making it almost impossible to avoid being covered in evidence. Indeed, forensic analysts later discovered bloodstains from one of her victims on her jacket. This recklessness suggests a dangerous psychological state. Maria wasn't just a predator, she was an emboldened one, convinced of her own invincibility. In her mind, the thrill of the kill and the satisfaction of her dark fantasy clearly outweighed any rational concern for the blood on her sleeve or the eyes of the crowd.
The sheer audacity of her street attacks reveals the cold steel at the core of her nature. Even most male serial killers would hesitate to take such risks, fearing recognition or capture. But for Maria, the risk was the point. There is a sense of profound defiance in her actions. She saw herself as the master of the situation, standing above the crowd. This speaks volumes about the structure of her character, a psychological framework built around a demonic core.
She wasn't just a woman with a disorder. She was a predator who found a dark sort of spiritual fulfillment in her dominance over life and death, defying the world to stop her.
There is a long-standing theory that, in their violent tactics, men act as hunters, while women act as gatherers. Historically, female killers target those within their immediate circle, family members, partners, or acquaintances, people they can reach out and touch. Their violence is typically intimate and domestic. Maria Petrova, however, completely shattered this evolutionary pattern. She stepped outside the domestic sphere and into the role of the predator. She didn't wait for victims to enter her life. She went out into the world to find them. By killing total strangers who simply happened to cross her path, she adopted a predatory hunting behavior that is almost exclusively associated with male serial killers. She was a statistical anomaly, a female hunter in a world of male victims.
She didn't have a type. This further proves that attempting to frame her actions as revenge for a past assault doesn't hold water. The argument simply isn't convincing. For Maria, the victim had to be a significant object, a biological, sexually mature male capable of putting up a fight. She didn't target frail old men with walking sticks, even though they would have been easy prey in any apartment hallway. The conclusion is clear. Petrova wasn't looking for a victim, she was looking for an adversary. She needed a rival whose perceived strength would validate her own dominance. Every strike was a contest she had already won in her mind, a way to prove that she, the predatory huntress, was superior to the very symbol of masculine power.
Maria Petrova was found guilty of 2 murders and 3 counts of attempted murder. A 4th attack was ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence. However, the court exempted her from criminal responsibility. After a rigorous analysis of her actions, forensic experts concluded that Petrova had acted in a state of legal insanity. They determined that due to her disorder, she was unable to comprehend the inherent danger of her actions or exercise control over them at the time of the crimes. Instead of a prison sentence, she was committed to a high-security psychiatric hospital for compulsory treatment, a closed institution where she remains under strict medical supervision, perhaps indefinitely.
Since 2001, Maria has remained in a psychiatric facility with no clear prospect of release. The duration of her stay remains an open question. In this sense, the order for compulsory treatment acts as a mechanism that can effectively keep her confined for the rest of her life. From a pragmatic standpoint, had she been found sane, she might have received a standard sentence, perhaps around 10 years of imprisonment. With the possibility of parole or other mitigating factors, she would have been back on the streets long ago. This irony reflects a cold, practical reality. In cases of extreme and unpredictable violence, the psychiatric label ensures a level of public safety that a fixed prison term simply cannot guarantee.
Compulsory psychiatric treatment is often perceived as a sentence worse than any prison, second only, perhaps, to the death penalty. There is little illusion of therapy here. In practice, it is a confinement far more absolute than a standard cell. Stripped of all autonomy, patients are subjected to a chemical regimen that keeps the mind in a state of perpetual haze, a forced alteration of consciousness that is far from comfortable. In a cassation appeal filed just 4 months after the verdict, Maria's lawyer fought to overturn the order for compulsory treatment. According to Dmitry Mironov, even Maria herself would have chosen a labor colony over the psychiatric ward. Interestingly, one of her victims shared this sentiment, demanding a prison sentence instead. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court remained unmoved, and the verdict stood. Maria Petrova was consigned to the silence of the institution.
Maria repeatedly pleaded to be sent to a labor colony, to the zone. Her reasoning was chillingly consistent with her predatory identity. She believed that behind bars, she would be commanded with respect. In her mind, being a killer, specifically a killer of men, made her strong, healthy, and superior. She craved a social hierarchy where her violence would be seen as a badge of honor, a place where her warrior status would finally be validated by her peers. And those who knew her had little doubt that she was right.
Over the 20-odd years of her confinement, Maria has made 2 desperate attempts to escape. Each time she was recaptured and transferred to facilities with even stricter security protocols. Every 6 months, she undergoes a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. A panel of experts must answer critical questions. Has her condition improved? Is she still a danger to herself or the public? But perhaps the most profound question lies beyond clinical markers. Has Maria Petrova ever truly felt remorse? In the world of forensic psychiatry, remorse isn't just an emotion, it's a prerequisite for reintegration. For someone whose identity was so deeply rooted in the Amazonian thrill of the hunt, true repentance would mean the total destruction of her former self. Without it, the gates remain closed, and the half-year cycle of evaluations continues, serving as a permanent tether between her dark past and an uncertain future.
She has accepted it as a simple matter of fact. To speak of remorse in her case is impossible. There is no evidence of inner torment or the weight of a guilty conscience. Nor can it be said that these past events are in any way traumatizing for her today. She views her crimes with a detached, clinical neutrality, as if they were merely chapters in a book she finished long ago.
Maria's parents have never fully severed ties. They continue to visit her in the hospital about once a month. According to Dmitry Mironov, their relationship with their daughter has stabilized over the years, yet the prospect of her potential release fills them with more anxiety than hope. Their primary fear isn't for Maria's well-being, but for the reaction of society and their neighbors. They are haunted by the reality that the world outside has not forgotten, and they dread the day they might have to face that world with Maria by their side once more.
Maria remains convinced that her release is imminent. Her dream hasn't changed. She wants to start a family and have children. When I look at her, I don't see a serial killer or a terrifying monster. I see a human being. It was a tragic confluence of factors, a deck of cards dealt in the worst possible way. Even after 20 years, not a single psychiatrist can provide a definitive answer as to what truly happened. I speak regularly with the doctors and psychologists at the facility, and the consensus remains the same. Even now, no one can say with 100% certainty what triggered that internal collapse.
This was the story of Maria Petrova, a woman who existed at the intersection of clinical pathology and a dark, primal power. For some, she will always be the Zyu'zino maniac, a phantom with a knife in her sleeve. For the legal system, she is a permanent resident of a closed ward, a statistical anomaly that had to be neutralized. But for those who looked closer, she remains an unsolved mystery. A person whose internal collapse could never be fully explained by even the most experienced doctors. She remains in her sterile purgatory, looking toward a future that may never come, still dreaming of the life that vanished the moment she chose the blade over the world. It is a story with no winners, only victims, broken lives, and the haunting realization that sometimes the human mind is a labyrinth from which there is no escape. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.